Good evening, folks. We're busy with Job's second reply to Eliphaz, and that's basically having a look at Job 16 to 17. If we start reading from verse 1 of chapter 16, we read this. Then Job answered and said, I have heard many such things. Miserable comforters are you all. Shall windy words have an end? Or what provokes you that you answer? Now, in these chapters 16 and 17, we find that we can divide Job's reply into four sections. And the first one is an expression of his disgust. And we've just read part of it in these first three verses. Job is declaring his disappointment in these friends. They were a major source of disappointment to him. He was expecting to get comfort from them, and he just wasn't getting anything of the kind. In fact, he had more condemnation than anything else. He calls them miserable comforters, and that literally in the Hebrew means comforters of trouble. That word trouble Eliphaz used in the last verse of chapter 15. Just as a matter of interest. And this is what he calls them. They are comforters of trouble. They're not comforters that bring him, that will strengthen him or anything like that. And once again, we have this reference to windy words, or words that have no real substance, no more substance than one would expect wind to have. And so these are comforters that do not console, they do not listen properly. Interestingly enough, Job seems to be expressing surprise that Eliphaz came back to him. In verse 3, he says, or what provokes you that you answer? That you is in the singular. In verses 4 and 5, the you over there is in the plural. So in verse 3, speaking particularly to Eliphaz, he said, what caused you to come back? And but in verses 4 and 5, where he says, if I could also speak as you do. And in verse 5 he says, I could strengthen you with my mouth, and the solace of my lips would assuage your pain. That's all in the plural. So that's just a matter of interest. He's addressing all of them as bad counselors. He's addressing Eliphaz and saying, I'm rather surprised that after our last encounter, you actually felt that you had a right or grounds to come back, that you had something to add to what you'd already said. Now, Job is also saying here that if the roles were reversed, Job would be able to attack them. They've opened themselves up to this sort of attack, but it talks about shaking one's head as an indication of mockery. He is complaining that they have mocked him, they've made fun of him, and they haven't been serious. Now, Job states that he would not do this. He would listen and console, he would encourage, and he would comfort. And that is if they were to change places. Job wouldn't be firing verbal bullets at them and deriding them. And to shake one's head mentions that it's an indication of mockery, and we find this coming out. And if you want examples of this, if you go to 2 Kings chapter 19 and verse 21 and Psalm 22 verse 7, you'll find that the same word is used to shake one's head, and the implication there is that it means to mock. So this is what's happening over here. Job had been a comfort to others in the past, and he knows how to bring comfort to people. And if they were in his position, if the roles were reversed, he would be giving them a real comfort. Then we read on from verse 6. If I speak, my pain is not assuaged, and if I forbear, how much of it leaves me? Surely now God has worn me out. He has made desolate all my company. He has shriveled me up, which is a witness against me, and my leanness has risen up against me. It testifies to my face. So once again, Job takes an opportunity to bemoan the torment that he has received at the hands of God. Whether he spoke up, he said, or whether he just remained silent and said nothing, his pain lingered on. It had no effect on it at all. God, he says, had worn him down and weakened him through his pain. He was distressed because his offspring, and he talks about my company, or his household, a reference to his servants and his children who died, had been slain. They were no longer, they'd been killed. And for another point, he was physically emancipated, as his gauntness clearly showed. If you looked at him, you could see all the weight that he had lost, and he was just a mere shadow of the person that he used to be. If we read on, he says this in verse 9, he has torn me in his wrath and hated me. He has gnashed his teeth at me. My adversary sharpens his eyes against me. Men have gaped at me with their mouths. They have struck me insolently on the cheek. They mass themselves together against me. God gives me up to the ungodly and casts me into the hands of the wicked. Job's distress is the second part, and we've just sort of read the introduction to this. Job's distress goes all the way down to verse 17, but he says that his distress relates to God, and God appears to him to be a ravenous beast who is attacking him and just tearing him up. It's quite a picture that he has over here, that God is angry with him and he's snarling and glaring at him, and Job is in a serious lot of trouble. Job was also distressed by the increasing opposition from people. These people amassed themselves against him like soldiers, is the sort of terminology that he's using. And God, he says, has left him in the hands of evil men who insult him and who make fun of him. The language is quite strong over here. But I want you to notice, just as we leave this section, that the reference to the ungodly people is a contradiction to Eliphaz saying that Job was wicked. What Job is actually saying is that God is the one who shattered him. And God is the one who, like a beast, has grabbed him by the neck and crushed him. God is the one who is being like a fierce animal. God is like an archer who's using Job for target practice, wounding him and causing his gall to spill out. Job has also likened God to a warrior attacking him. All this Job said was wrong, and of course we know that Job was in ignorance of really what is happening behind the scene, and so when he attributes all of this to God, he's wrong. But in verse 12 we read this: I was at ease and he broke me apart. He seized me by the neck and dashed me to pieces. He set me up as his target. His archers surround me. He slashes open my kidneys and does not spare. He pours out my gall on the ground. He breaks me with a breach upon breach. He runs upon me like a warrior. Man, the language that he uses here is so strong. He just wants everybody to know that God has crushed him, that God is using him for target practice. God is shooting these arrows into him that are wounding him. God has totally destroyed him, and that his gall has just run out all over the place. He's trying to create a picture of the intensity of his suffering. This is the real part of Job's distress, and it comes out in these few verses that we have read. He is also concerned that not only has God placed him as and fired arrows at him. These divine arrows have wounded Job and caused his gall to run out. But we need to recognize the fact that Job was actually wrong in seeing God as a warrior attacking him, because it wasn't God who was attacking him. It was the devil. He got it a little bit wrong over there. God was the one who was on his side. God was the one who, when Satan came into God's presence, was defending him and declaring to Satan, look at my servant Job, a man who is upright and blameless, who fears God, and who habitually turns away from evil. God was the one who was defending him. But nevertheless, Job is just declaring his distress and what it appeared to him to be. And then he goes on and he says this in verse 15. He says, I have sewed sackcloth upon my skin and have laid my strength in the dust. My face is red with weeping, and my eyelids is deep and on my eyelids is deep darkness. Although there is no violence in my hands, and my prayer is pure. Job is really talking about the fact that he's suffering, and he's really suffering, he feels, unfairly. This is not what he'd signed up for. This is not what Job wanted. He clothes himself in sackcloth or burlap, and the fact that he thrusts his brow into the dust, and the redness of his eyes and the dark rings under them are clearly seen, are all symptoms, are all indications of the distress that he found himself in. He was not a terrible person, so why all this torment is the question that he's asking. He's saying, I'm not bad. There is no violence in me, and my prayer is pure. Why am I being treated in this unfair manner? Why am I suffering all these things? And then we come to the third part and that we want to deal with, and that's Job's desire. He says this, O earth, in verse 18, cover not my blood, excuse me, and let my cry find no resting place. Even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies for me is on high. My friends scorn me, my eye pours out tears to God, that he would argue the case of a man with God, as a son of man does with his neighbor. Now, Job is declaring the things that he desires. First of all, he desires that his innocent would cry out from the ground. And I think the sort of analogy that he's using over here is what we find in Genesis chapter 4, verse 10, where God comes to Cain and he says to him, where is Abel, your brother? And Cain says, I have no idea. Am I my brother's keeper? And God says to him, the blood of your brothers crying out from the ground to me. And this is the situation that we have here. Job is saying, I'm going to die, but I don't want my blood to be covered. I don't want my cry to find a resting place. I don't want it to be silenced. I want God to be able to hear the cry of my innocence, that I'm dying unfairly and unjustly. You see, his cry for justice would be heard. This is his desire. Oh, that they would just hear my cry for justice. He wanted to have a witness in heaven. In verse 19, this comes out, even now, behold, my witness is in heaven, and he who testifies me is on high. Job wants a representative in heaven to plead his case with God. And the reason why he needs this is because his friends have not been fulfilling that role. They haven't been on his side. And so he brings this out in verse 22. He says, for when a few years have come, I shall go away, from which I shall not return. My spirit is broken, chapter 17, verse 1. My days are extinct. The graveyard is ready for me. Surely there are mockers about me, and my eye dwells on their provocation. What Job is desiring is that he sees his life drawing to an end, to a close rather rapidly, and is also stating that he's depressed. He says, my spirit is broken. The graveyard is ready for me. Job is really battling in this whole thing. And then he goes on in this chapter 17, and he says this in verse 3, lay down a pledge for me with yourself. Who is there who will put up security for me? Since you have closed their hearts to understanding, therefore you will not let them triumph. He who informs against his friends to get a share of their property, the eyes of his children will fail. Now, he goes on with declaring the things that he desires. First of all, he's saying that although God is against him, God is the only one who can provide a pledge for him. Now, that reference to a pledge is in court cases in those days, somebody would be required to pay a pledge which was given to the court, to the judges of the matter, so that the other person would not suffer loss. And he's saying this, I wish that somebody, that God would provide a pledge for me, somebody in heaven would do this. Job had to make an arrangement with God. And this is what he's trying to do, because his friends didn't believe in his innocence. And because they weren't convinced of his innocence, they would not fairly represent him before God and in God's presence. And so he had this amazing disadvantage. Then he goes on in from verse 6 onwards, we have Job's dilemma. He's sitting on the horns of a dilemma. He's got these two issues that are at stake. On the one hand, there is his desire to get away from this whole thing, for his life to end, and for him to land up in the quietness and the darkness of the grave where he would be hidden. But on the other hand, he just wants to get some kind of vindication for the things that he is going through. So he starts off, let's read from verse 6 onwards. It says, he has made me a byword of the peoples, and I am one before whom men spit. My eye has grown dim from vexation, and all my members are like a shadow. The upright are appalled at this, and the innocent stirs himself up against the godless. Yet the righteous holds to his way, and he who has clean hands grows stronger and stronger. Job challenges his friends to find fault with him, because he knows there is no fault. He makes the point that anyone who is innocent would be appalled at the unfair treatment Job has received because of his innocence. Nevertheless, he is growing in his conviction of his innocence and certain of his position before God. Verse 9 brings that out clearly. Yet the righteous holds to his way, and he who has clean hands grows stronger and stronger. And this is the point that he's making. I am becoming more and more convinced that I do not deserve what has happened to me. And then we get to the fourth part, the last part of chapter 17, where we actually mentioned that before, where we have Job's dilemma. And so here from verse 10 we read this, but you, come on again, all of you, and I shall not find a wise man among you. My days are past, my plans are broken off, the desires of my heart. They make night into day. The light, they say, is near to darkness. If I hope for Sheol as my house, if I make my bed in darkness. And he goes on in that way. What he's saying, just very quickly, he sarcastically states that none of these friends of his are wise. You can't find any wise amongst them. He goes on to say that his life, his plans, and his desires have all come to nothing because of the disaster that has followed him and that has come upon him. And then in verse 14 he goes on and he says, if I say to the pit, you are my father, and to the worm, my mother, or my sister, where then is my hope? Who will see my hope? Shall it not go down to the bars of Sheol? Shall we not descend together into dust? Job by this time had lost all hope of survival or of recovery. There was no light coming, and restoration was unrealistic to Job. It just wasn't going to happen. His only expectation was to the grave and to decay. That's the only thing that he could see coming. Job pictured Sheol as his home and adopt creation. He was going to adopt creation as his father, and his mother or sister would be a worm that would eat away his mortal remains. You see, in the very last verse of this chapter, he says that he will go down to the bars of Sheol. He will descend together into the dust. Job has just come to the end. This is his feeling, and this is where he ends his second defense and his second reply to Eliphaz. It's a sad story, isn't it? It's a tough one. Now, I just want to say that I'm wanting to finish this up before Christmas, so what I'm going to do from now onwards, I'm going to summarize rather than analyze like we've been doing almost verse by verse, the details of the things that are being said and the arguments that these various people are bringing together. I'm going to put them all together. I'm going to put all Eliphaz's arguments, all Bildad's arguments, all Zophar's arguments together, and we'll look at them all together. And Job's responses, we'll put them all together and just try and understand what is going on. What are these people saying? Why are they saying it? What is the basis of their theology? And then I just want to spend a little bit of time looking at what God says to Job and how this reflects on his friends who were wrong. Now, I just want to say that some of their theology was right, but some of it was wrong. And what was wrong wasn't so much what they believed theologically, but what was very wrong was the application of their theology. And I think we've got to learn the difference between what we actually believe and the way in which we apply what we believe to people in certain situations. So let's just pray together. Father, we just come to you once again and thank you for your word. We thank you for men like Job that give us an example of what it is to suffer and to endure patiently and to still maintain our faith and our confidence and our trust in God. And so I just pray that you'd help us to be such people, that the things of life, the trials and the difficulties will not rob us of our joy, and most certainly will not rob us of our faith and our confidence in a lovely, merciful, wonderful God. For we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.